big welcome. Thank you for coming out on a very cold and wintry evening for our first winter talk this year. So just saying that on behalf of Te Anau Waitangi Charitable Trust. If you don't know me, I think I know a lot of the people here. My name's Kerry Edge. And on behalf of the Trust, I'm really excited to introduce our first winter speaker for this year, Dr Jane Kitson. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Jane, who I've known for quite some time. We first met back in the early 90s doing postgraduate study together at the University of Otago. So, and for many of you, Jane won't need an introduction. Indeed, her connections to Murihiku, Southland, are very deep. So Jane whakapapas to Ōraka-Aparima, Waihopai and Awarua Rūnanga, and therefore I really want to acknowledge her relationship to this area, to Te Anau and Manapuri, especially this evening as this is where we're gathering. The title of Jane's talk is Manawa Kanakana, which references the determination and endurance of the kanakana, piharau or pouched lamprey. So Jane tells me that she loves talking about this as one of her favourite fish species. So I'm going to briefly just say a few things about Jane to introduce her, because I know she's very modest and she wouldn't say this. But in case you don't understand all of the ways in which Jane connects into her work and into this place in our community. So Jane is an ecologist, an environmental scientist with research interests in freshwater, mahinga kai and cultural monitoring. She's the director of her own company, Kitson Consulting Limited. So this is an environmental entity that links values and science to support mana whenua in their environmental management aspirations and needs. Jane is a board member of Ngāi Tahu o Te Maramatanga, so that's New Zealand's Māori Centre of Research Excellence, a member of the Guardians of Lakes Manapōuri, Monowai, Te Anau, Te Waio, and also a board member of Te Waio Mahika Kai Trust and the Rakiura Titi Islands administering body. Okay. Jane lives in Invercargill and is a mother to two teenage sons, and she's the wife of Zane Moss, and some of you might know Zane. He's the manager of Southland Fish and Game. Her family has a strong interest in hunting and gathering mahinga kai pursuits, including trout and salmon fishing, duck and deer hunting, kai moana gathering, and titi mutton bird harvesting. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge, on behalf of the Trust, the grant that we've received for these winter talks from the Community Organisation Grant Scheme, COGS, for their generous support that's enabled us to help bring Jane here this evening, and I'd just like everyone to give Jane a really warm welcome.
Nā mihi kia koutou katoa. Obviously you know who I am, because Kerry Ann has told you all about me. And now I can finish and talk about fish. So I was born in Lumsden, for those that don't know, so I was born close by. My parents were living in Mossburn at that time. Don't ask me how long ago, because that is quite private now. That's old age. And Dad was a top dresser pilot at that time, and my mother was working in the venison factory while she was pregnant with me. So we started here. Dad's family has come from Southland, from Bluff, so generation on generation. So very proud of my linkages on Dad's side and Mum's side also. One of my relatives, Jane Valance, came over on the beautiful Star from France and married into the Mortons at Morton Lane. So a long connection with this area, and very proud of my heritage of being a Southlander from Murihiku, my attachment to Rakiura, Stewart Island, and yeah, so sometimes I just don't understand why people don't love Southland more than they do. They seem to think there's icebergs here or something. That's not true. And so I'm talking to you about a species that is across Aotearoa, New Zealand, but is really a special one in Murihiku and Southland, and I'll show you by the end of here today, you'll see, realise it's special for the Waio catchment as well. So bring you to that component. So I better tell you where I'm taking you in this warning. Zane always says if I start talking about kanakana, you might be here for a while, so sorry about that. And I do start dancing, so you know. So where I'm taking you today, I'm going to talk a little bit about native fish in the Waio and native fish in general in Southland. But then I'll soon kick into my favourite native fish. Well, I have others as well. I do like other ones that I can eat. So kanakana, lamprey, and there's got other names as well. A little bit about the history of the mihingakai, or the components of mihingakai and what I mean when I say that word. And in relation to the kanakana harvest as well. I've borrowed a piece of work. Meridian and Niwa kindly lent me some work that they've just recently done about distribution in the Waio catchment of kanakana, so I'll show you that today. A little bit about the monitoring that whānau have been doing in Murihiku, because they really, to be honest, have kick-started a lot of the monitoring, a lot of the research that I'm talking about today is because of their efforts. Because kanakana sort of fall into that big pit of not being commercial and then not being really valued or seen as valued. And so actually understanding that whānau, obviously I've got a big heart, big connection with the species, and so they've done a lot of work and a lot of advocacy to actually start getting a lot more research, which you'll see when I get into the more recent work that we've done on spawning habitat and behaviour. And I've got some really cool vids to show you about that, because they're really unique species of lamprey and behave quite differently than overseas lamprey. And a little bit about how you can look after kanakana when you're thinking about it, things like with climate change, things like that. So Southland, we've got lots of wonderful native fish, and the ones that are circled are the ones that spend a little bit of time in the sea. So it's really important to understand the connection from the sea to up the rivers, into your lakes, the roto and the wetlands is really important. And so you've got lots and lots that will be out in the sea. You've got some of the sort of more, they'll be non-migratory, they just hang out in places inland. And then you've got your other wonderful species here. So this is the kanakana lamprey, and I'll talk about that. It sort of looks like it's grouped into this sort of eel-like fish. And this we start as saying that one's threatened, naturally vulnerable, and if you were going to compare that to a bird, that would be a takahe level. Okay, so it's quite threatened. So I've stolen this from the Meridian survey about the fish in your Waio catchment. So you've got 17 native species present. 11 are at risk or threatened, so in the risk category that they're you're getting worried about them, or they're threatened, you're really worried about them. 4 threatened, nationally vulnerable, and that's one of them is your kanakana, and the others will be your non-migratory laxids, and 6 at risk and declining. And so you'll see a mixture of some migratory, need to go up and down the rivers, and I'll talk a bit more about the lamprey's crazy life cycle, and other ones like the long-fin eel will also do a long journey, as well as your short-fin eel, and things like inanga can be migratory and non-migratory. They can have a landlocked cycle. So yeah, there's some adaptation to some of these species. Yes. And you do have species that are not threatened, yay, in the catchment. And then these short-fin eels, your mullet that will be more close to the coast. And smelt is the same, it's a bit more closer to the coast as well. So yeah, kanakana lamprey will be also called piharau in the North Island. That's the most common names, but you've got other names like pia, korokoro, nai, and the name's endless. So when we were first talking about research and bringing whānau from different parts of the world, of the country together, we actually had to show a picture. This is what we're talking about, because we didn't know, and actually didn't know that there were harvesters down in the South Island. So Whanganui and Taranaki are really important fisheries up there. They didn't know about the Murihiku harvesters, and I'll show you some of the sites down here. So it's a mysterious fish. We didn't talk very much about harvesting it. It's the sole lamprey species in New Zealand. It's called the pouch lamprey because I think you can see the pouch. Now that's the male when it's sexually mature. Okay, so they do They start off a bit more prettier than that. I think they actually get quite blind at the end, so maybe that doesn't matter, but we're not sure what that pouch is. We've had researchers I work with and they've dissected it and they have no idea what it's for. It might be to help settle sediment in the burrows that I'll talk about where they nest, but it's a bit of a mystery. Maybe it just looks really good for the female kanakana, I'm not sure. They're really hard to monitor. Now, a fish, like most of our New Zealand native fish, are nocturnal. They're a bit shy about being around in the daytime. Kanakana, when they move up the river, usually do it when it's high flows and you can't see through the water, really murky. They also live in the sediments, so they're not screaming out, I'm here, except when they're in their migratory runs. So when you go out at night, you can, and there's some places in Murihiku, you can see them running, and that's probably one of the wonders of the world and the natural phenomenon when you see that, all of them on the rocks. And you would have seen the picture at the start. That's in Niagara Falls in Ngāi Tahu. You know, they're just beautiful, and we've had stories of them being over paddocks, crossing roads in the old days, because there were so many of them. So hard to monitor. So the normal ways of using electric fishing machines doesn't really pick up all of them, and so you have to use it in a different way. Nets, you actually have to be an expert or know what you're doing, and so harvesters know what they're doing. When we're setting nets as scientists, we may not be doing this. We have to. It won't be. You have to purposely set it to catch kanakana. And there are other ways that I'll talk about that are more passive that we can use now. So we don't really know how many of these are around, but the general perception is that they declined, and the stories that you get from whānau and people that live in catchments with them that they have declined, because they're not talking about them blocking trains anymore or going across roads. And certainly in the North Island, when you talk to them, they are very saddened by the amount that they don't catch anymore. Obviously important customary fishery. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I will mention a little of the lamprey reddening syndrome as we go along. There's been a disease that's turned up in 2011 that we noticed, may have been around longer, which is another concern for this species. Now, one thing, they sometimes get called lamprey eel. Eel, lamprey are quite different species. One has bones, that's the eel. The other one is cartilaginous, so it's not got bones. It's a very ancient species as well. It's tuna has covered gills. When you see a kanakana, they've got little slits. And I think most people understand kanakana might have this the sucky vampire of the sea kind of look going on, and I'll explain why that is. And that's a very distinctive feature of lamprey. Whereas you've got fish with a jaw up here. So it's jawless, it's called a jawless fish. One breeds in the ocean, so that's your tuna, and one breeds in fish water, and I'll talk about that. So spends a lot of time in fish water and is quite vulnerable in that period of time. Now I mentioned that kanakana are quite ancient. So the first lamprey that appeared in fossil records was 450 million years ago. So you're looking at what happened in 350 million years ago. So a landscape, a world was quite different in that time. Often hear about tuatara being the fossil, living fossil. It appears up there. So it's gone through the age of dinosaur, and then this modern fish over here with tuna, a much earlier species. So it is literally a living fossil. It's been around for a very, very long time. Southern hemisphere lamprey, there's two species. Came off the line at a different time than northern hemisphere species, so they're quite distinct. And our geotrio, our pouch lamprey, is quite unique in the way it handles itself. When you go to a conference with lamprey people, they're really probably quite enthusiastic about lamprey. In fact, probably could call us nudie. But when they talk about geotria or our pouch lamprey, they get that kind of glaze in the sense that they're very excited because it's so different than other species. And it makes it interesting for when looking at medical things. When you're talking about this is one of the earlier vertebrates alive now, and looking at possibilities for medical science as well, because it acts quite differently than humans and other animals. So, wiki life cycle of kanakana, piharau. So, they will start. Where should I start? Right, I'll start when they are mature adults. Okay, so they're up the river for at least a year and a half. Usually, as soon as they find a burrow or place to hide, they stay there and they nest together, and I'll show you pictures of that as we go along. So they spend a lot of time in the rivers just waiting, and that's probably understandable because they've come up the river and not eating. So that's why when they come up the river they're quite delectable, because they've got lots of lipids. They're going to fast for a long time. They spawn, and in the nest, the eggs will hatch, and these little larvae or ammocetes, which you'll hear me talk about a little bit later as we go on, they look like little eels. They can be quite small to start off with, look tiny. And they've got little hoods. Sorry, I am going to start dancing like on that hoods. They are filter feeders. So they filter all the detritus in the water through. So they're starting very vegan, vegetarian or omnivorous kind of stuff. And they go through a number of metamorphoses. But they're living in the sediment and come up at night to feed, come back in the sediment. So sediments are quite important for the species, oxygenating sediments. And for 3 or 4 years, and then they turn into mini blue ones. And they go from the hood to the disc. So they've changed quite dramatically. Early zoologists thought they were different species at these different stages, as you would think, you could understand that. So one that looks kind of like a little eel with a hood, then something that's got a mouth disc, and then this adult over here, quite distinct. So once you get these guys, they'll start migrating out to sea. So again, sea, freshwater is important in this life cycle. 3 or 4 years. Now this is a really mysterious part of their life cycle. We don't really know much about there because they're out at sea, but they're attached to fish and whales, and they are parasites. So that's kind of where their teeth come in, because they suck onto the skin, and they have 2 little teeth. If you ever pick one up and you say, oh, they won't hit you, but they will, because you'll suck them in, and their 2 little teeth will have a bite of you. And it sounds really awful, but they work away and eat the juices and the flesh. But yeah, don't take it against them. And then they came back in the freshwater for 3 or 4 years later, migrate up the rivers, and this is the stage when harvesters will start grabbing them, because that's that migration back. And then spend a year and a half not eating in the freshwater, holding up, trying to avoid being eaten by eels and shags and people, to become an adult and start that cycle again. So a long-lived species, and one that does remarkable journeys in their life cycle, remarkable changes from going from fresh to seawater to fresh. That's quite a lot of physiological change for a fish as well.
So will they spawn more than once, or do they?
No, just once, and then yeah. So yeah, it has to mean a lot. So maybe that's why they're looking like that, sort of extra.
Do both the male and female have the power?
No, just the male. So, and that's why people see the male more often, because it's more distinctive. Female is, they get shorter and stubbier. I think that's just middle age, I think. But females also have a rope, and they're not sure why. She's got a rope, a sort of a mass on her back. In Northern Hemisphere, that's usually the male of the lamprey that does it. It's sort of a heat regulating thing. We're not sure about why. So they're just adding more mysteries for us. In fact, it wasn't that long ago that we actually witnessed spawning and knew what they were doing there. Northern Hemisphere lamprey spawn in gravels like salmon. Our ones don't. So they have taken a long time to get to know them. And I think partly is to get to know people who actually harvest them and have that relationship with them. Then the kanakana let us witness something more. So mahinga kai, when I use that term, it's not just about tuna or kanakana or the species being present. It's also about the other resources being harvested or being used. So kanakana, you could, depending on what method you use, you may be needing bracken fern to help make some traps and things like that. So about the resources being used, the ability to access to the resource. Now that can be either getting through private land, or there's a lot of legislative barriers to that, or it's just really difficult because it's really slippery, or those kind of things, health and safety matters. Or you touch the water and it's unhealthy to do so. So it's those all sorts of things when you're talking about access. It's about those special sites where gathering occurs. Now for kanakana, there's different methods used. In Murihiku, there are sites that are more waterfalls or falls, and so it's easier to pluck them off, but you would have to have a connection to that place where your whakapapa rights to allow you to harvest there. So it's actually, that's your site. You can't go and necessarily go and jump on someone else's site. And I know in other rivers up north, they have this particular spot on the river, on the Awa, that they put their nets in, and if the river goes lower and your nets are dry, you can't just move it, because, you know. So it's active gathering and using a resource. So it's all very well harvesting it. But you need to know how to. You need to know how to do it appropriately, with appropriate tikanga, but you also need to know how to process that resource in the best way. It's also about not just them being there, but it's also about the health and condition. Once you're gathering mahinga kai, it's often an activity not only like economy, but also social cohesion. You gather some thick kai, you'd give it to kamatui, older people, or people that can't access it, or you're trading, you're doing bartering, like some of their mutton birds will swap for kanakana, or, you know, it's those kind of things. It's a really, when you hear stories from whānau, they're talking about getting a feed, but the feed is actually being spread quite a wide distance in the community, and that's a community connection, either within your own community or connection with other Māori communities around the place. Mahinga kai is what we would call a principal environmental indicator. It's where we can assess the environment. If it's not there, if it can't be used, all these other factors, then something's wrong with the environment. And it has been called the central pillar to the Ngāi Tahu identity and wellbeing, and it was the central po in our treaty settlement. So there was 9 tall trees, and one of them was Mahinga kai, because it's such a highly valued. And for Ngāi Tahu down south, Mahinga kai is the way we lived, and we was very seasonal because we couldn't grow anything until the potato came around, which was amazing, and meant that we could stay a bit more stationary. We were moving around to get different kais, and there was different seasons for different food types. And kanakana would have been really important because it's full of fat, keep you going. And heart risk wasn't an issue back then. And so I've got a quote. I did some work a few years back when there was the lamprey breeding syndrome started turning out, and so it was talking to people and harvesters. I thought this one was important, and that's the quote says, "It is very important to be able to provide kanakana. Mana is at risk, so your prestige, the mana of your marae and the whole area." So if you're known for kanakana in your area, you're known to you should be able to provide it, and it's diminishing if you can't, if it's not around. There's a whole lot of different aspects tied up with Mahinga kai, which I think you would have gathered from me babbling on just about then. So different attributes, things, it's food, it's a whakapapa identity, so whakapapa being, we also whakapapa in the environment as well, we're part of it, but we also whakapapa to sites, we have connections to sites. It's a treasured species, food, sharing of food, kai, being able to connect to those preferred sites, those sites that we've always connected to, our ancestors connected to, trade, and then there's all the environmental conditions as well to support that fish and that fisher, that harvesting activity as well. And so there are quite different methods of harvesting kanakana. I think you probably all recognise Matauda Falls, and that's got a mataitai, so it's a freshwater customary protection area, and one of the species that's for is for kanakana, because that's a very important customary fishery area, and there it's plucking it off the rocks. There's other awa, the in Waikawa, they've got rocks or rock boulders coming out of the water, and they'll either go at night, so some whānau will go at night and gather them at night off the rocks with their torches. Some will go during the day when the river's a little bit lower, and actually because kanakana need to hide because everything else must eat them, so they will use sticks with little hooks on them and catch it that way. And there are other techniques like using bracken fern, like I mentioned. So it's kind of want to hide. So if you can put something that they can hide in, then you can make little traps and they'll go in there, hide, and that's the way of gathering it. In the North Island, and it's also, I think, Lower Waitangi and other areas in Ngāi Tahu, they used to use giant weirs. So being able to put it in the right place. And so the kanakana would come into these sort of high water velocities and get pushed out back into the hinaki, the nets. So a lot of technology, lots of different ways of catching them. So a lot of ingenuity, lots of that all really depends on what that river or the awa was doing. There also, you can use hinaki, so let me really shame, I've got some. You can use nets as well. But again, you need to know what the awa's doing at that particular time and how to place it in the river. I often got told off by the Taranaki folk that I wasn't doing it very well, but I'll take that as, yes, that's true. But I thought so. So there are different techniques, and there's other techniques as well, just maximising on the behaviour of the kanakana. So just sort of highlighting that through harvesting and being connected to them, they actually know a lot about their behaviour as well, which has actually been really helpful for science. I'm just going to grab some water because I'm now getting dry. There's now the heat's come on. So different harvesting sites. Now there's not all of them because I'm not going to tell you all the secret sites. But different than Waikawa is known for it because it's also the Mataitai, the Taito Falls. There's a site further down that was used to have the big weirs as well. Porokina River, I've heard whānau talk about that. Waia River, I've heard of certain falls and areas in the Waia River. So it was actually a large customary fishery as well. And yeah, and I have caught them here too. And also further in the Matariki and Pumahaka as well. There's a lot of these rivers and Matariki and Manawa, a lot of them have got bedrock, and so that would be partly the ease of catching them, because if you've got rock they're climbing across, you can catch them easily that way. There is a technique, you grab one in the wrong place, you'll end up losing more. So the methods vary from region to region. They also use different indicators or tuhu to actually go and gather them. So often when we were doing monitoring earlier on, I would talk about the shags or the kauau. They're a big indicator of when the runs were happening. People wouldn't understand why I was talking about shags when I was supposed to be talking about kanakana. But they are an indicator when they're coming in the river. Local knowledge talks about in the lower Waio, when lots of shags arrived there, that's when they were running down there in that awa. And it can be as early as May in that area as well. So there were large runs. Other tohu would be around the moon. Some will talk about temperature and and the flows. If you've got a high fresh, they would come on after that. So they like the high flows, they like the darker water, because if you're travelling you don't want to get eaten. And they like to travel mass, and I think that's partly because they don't want to get picked out by all the predators. If you're in a group, they're less likely to do that. But yeah, lots of other tohu that people talk about. So it's not just about the fish, it's about everything that connects with that fish as well when we're talking about them. And also I suppose it's really important to understand that to pass on knowledge about the harvest and the fish, you have to continue practice, and that's really difficult if your fishery is just disappearing or your conditions in the river, your flows have changed, or you haven't got enough water, or it doesn't peak at the right times. And it's sort of really important to understand that's not something, and I think you all understand when you're harvesting yourselves, that you have to physically do it. You can't read a book, you have to be in that place and connected to that place. And that's how people learn. So when I go to the Muttled Islands, my kids learn not following me, telling them, but then practicing and then alongside, and hopefully paying attention and setting the block on. Right, so that's the Hingakai component done, dusted. No one asleep quite yet. Right.
All good.
Okay, good. It's always unnerving when someone's asleep. So they often wake up. I've often had kamatua go to sleep and I know all of this, and they ask really gnarly questions, but they manage to do it while they're sleeping. I wish I had that now. Now, this is the material that I borrowed. Well, I was linked by Niwa. They have done a wider fish survey, and hopefully they provide that later on. I particularly asked for the kanakana components, and so that's Niwa, Emma Eden, and Andrew Fairman lent me that, and they have been doing work in 2021 and 2022. And that work was mostly, in fact, all around the baby section, the emesotes, the larvae. Remember the footed ones? We'll go away with that. And so this is a distribution map of the wire catchment, and so the pink and the yellows are where they were found. So there's obviously some in the first survey. They certainly found them in the lower, below the MLC, but they have found them above as well. So they are managing to get across the barrier, but they are very good climbers. Maybe not in as high numbers, but they are certainly there. And distribution, abundance. So the Lilburn seems to have a high abundance of them, which is great. Must be a method of them, but there's certainly more up to the top as well. The Whitestone, Manawa, Flaxy Creek, the South Sea Creek, as well, which is quite encouraging for that species. And the way they found them was electric fishing, but using a particular technique. So generally you do 3 pass for fish surveys, but for kanakana, because they live in the sediment, the little babies, they were targeting certain habitat and pulsing, so to see if they would come up. And so this is where, no, a bit hard to tell, this is where kanakana live, the babies. So in sort of sedimenty areas. Not heavy sediment, because then that's got no oxygen, so there's a certain, you have to have a certain substrate, but sort of on the sides of things as well. But the picture's upper here.
That doesn't necessarily mean they're not there, it's just they weren't found when they were looking.
Yes, and that's exactly it. So when you're looking at that, I definitely found them, but there will be other areas in the catchment that there will be. It doesn't look like that's right. Yeah, so you can still see the cobbles, but there is some sediment places where they're hiding, well, living, which is pretty exciting. A whole lot of work has actually been done recently in a research program I've been involved in, looking at trying to give guidance to how to find kanakana, because they're so cryptic. Larvae may be easier to find with electric fishing, and there's also a couple other techniques I'll talk about. But the adults, because they're hiding in the banks, and they might be hiding in holes under debris, but then they're trying to hide, or even in the gravels. You go past with an electric fishing machine, they actually probably will be starting to stay there, and they're not going to move really. So very cryptic species. So whānau were quite concerned in the late 2000s about the abundance in Murihiku, so and this is in Nuakawa, so they applied for funding to look using their sort of cultural harvesting, because that's using catch per unit effort or catch rates is often a way you can estimate abundance. And so we started looking in 2009. I was invited to help write the report, so that's how I got involved. No one wanted to write the report. And then we worked together to get some funding from Ngāi Tahu, and we brought in a Ditson, which is a acoustic camera, sort of sonar type thing. It was developed in the States for finding mines and waterways and things like that. And we used that to try and correlate the harvest counts with what was going past. And it was quite closely connected. We also looked at other harvest techniques as a possible monitoring tool as well, because if you can continue the practice and do the practice and monitor at the same time, that really does help. And we also did some work on trying to look at the prevalence of lamprey wreathing syndrome. So I'm going to show some nasty pictures, so if you don't want to see them. So lamprey wreathing syndrome sort of turned up in 2011. There was a mass mortality at the Matauri Falls. And for a number of years afterwards, we were monitoring for it to see where it was popping up. And we found it, well, I found it in all the catchments I monitored, including the Waihopai River. Yeah, so it's obviously affected this adult male. You can tell it's pretty blistering and bruising, hemorrhaging in the skin. Yeah, and so they're very docile. A lot of times they will just be dopey. For a fish that doesn't want to be seen during the day, they're often doing stupid behaviours. And a lot of whitebaiters actually helped with reporting them in as well, because they were just so dopey at that time of year that they would swim into the nets. So they're reported, monitored by tangata whenua, so because no one knew how to catch these things, so it really required the harvesters to be involved because no one else could do it. And so they will help monitor the different rivers from the Ōraka-Aparima, Ōriti, Mataura, Mokarita. We had an awesome farmer, sheep farmer, who allowed us to go and do it during lambing. In fact, he ended up doing it himself. Absolutely, didn't even know they were there, but completely fell in love with them, and we fell in love with him. And the Waikawa as well. River. It turned out we couldn't find a disease or pathogen, so it may be stress related, and so this is something that and there is some work I've been looking at, some of the mātauranga that I've interviewed people with on, that might be more stress related, or maybe this is some of the signs of climate change. But we are, hopefully, fingers crossed, we're in the fund for bidding for an Endeavour fund to sort of look at this as a disease or what it is. So we haven't stopped looking for it or what it's causing it. It could be quite stress related. And then there was some recent research. There was another Endeavour fund that we were looking at. And so this was with Niwa, my partner in crime, Niwa Cindy Baker. She is probably much Dr. Lamprey, really. And I'm the sort of her assistant lamprey person. So we were looking at, you need to know where the babies are to look after that conservation. You also need to figure out what the adults are doing, because they're spending a lot of time in the freshwater. What are they doing there? Okay, so this research was looking at that sort of fundamental gaps in those life stages. So we're looking at spawning habitats in this one. The first spawning site was found in 2013 for Kanakana in this country. So it's been a long time hiding what it does. So it must have earned its trust by that time. And so we were really focused on that reproductive ecology and where do they spawn? And in what kind of different habitats. In the study area of Waikawa, and Murihiku was the Waikawa River and the Catlins, and we're working with whānau in there. They helped us a lot with either helping with the sites, with field work. We pay them to do field work because, of course, again, these guys know the area really well, and they were magnificent. So there's different pictures of us looking for this morning areas, looking for their habitats in all sorts of glorious places. And I mentioned some techniques for trying to look for them. Kanakana, the babies produce this sort of smell, a pheromone. It's almost like advertising, come here, this is a good place to come. Sorry, I'm now trying to imitate. And so a lot of our native fish use smell. So if it's too muddy or too dirty or polluted, the water sometimes, or you haven't got enough flume coming up, they can't pick it up. But Kanakana use smell to find where the best places to go, to that signal. We found that out because there is a invasive lamprey in the States, in the Great Lakes, and they spend a lot of money trying to get rid of it, which they still haven't, but they spend a lot of money researching it, so we found out about the pheromones, and we Cindy was able to start using that and thinking about that in this circumstances here. So yeah, learning how to kill something sometimes helps looking after it. So these samplers, they stay in the river for about 2 to 3 weeks, sort of picking up the smells and the sort of material that's between those metal, and it goes to the lab and they can extract it. It has it's really good, also has its pitfalls in that it can be things can grow on it, algae and stuff like that. If it's too long, your river can go down and suddenly make it dry, and it doesn't like that. Also, it's very hard to know the detection limit. So a non-detect doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. See, I did do something, I did a lot of that. But once we located tributary in the Waikawa that made sense to be able to monitor, because the Waikawa River is a big river. I mean, Cindy came down there, this is not an easy section to do. No, it's not. But so we located a part of the river that we could work on. We put antennae at the bottom of the stretch, and we caught, with permission from the whānau and whānau helping, kind of at the rocks where they normally catch it, the falls down below, Niagara and another set of falls, and we put pit tags in them. And so we tracked it's a long time. Yeah, the fish got anaesthetised and stuff, but I wouldn't still. So several researchers ended up getting tagged themselves too, so yeah. We all suffered that. But tagged that, a lot of work going up and down the rivers, so whānau, we're helping with that, as well as some niwa stuff, as well as myself. Lots of walking in waders in summer, in water. But we knew when they were going, if they went out, because there's antennas, and we also had for 1 year, there was 2 different stretches. We knew which one was being used the most, and so when the flood did eventually take it out, because that's what rivers do, they take out things, we knew which section they would go, and it was the one that had more strength in the pheromones as well, so that made sense to us. And we tracked them from July, when we put them in, till a year after, then another 6 months, to find out where they were. And when we used the endoscope to try and get in the cavities to actually see what they were doing. And so those are eggs that you can see right there. And so we, after all that effort, found 13 spawning nests. And most of them went to modified areas rather than the bush-clad areas. But then again, we were releasing them up there, and it was a wee while to get to the bush-clad areas anyway. We did find one nest in a forestry block, which was pretty awesome. So we did have lots of the forestry guys knowing that we're in and out of that area quite a bit. And we did have evidence that they were reusing the holes, if those holes in the burrows stayed there. And that's another nest in there. They would usually have a small cavity, like in the rock or in the bedrock, and the eggs would be on the top, and it's really tiny, squishy places that would be, because they want to avoid the eels coming in. So if you didn't, you had to sort of break into their nests and put them in the scope. If you didn't cover it up enough, the eels would come and clean them out. So eels are a big predator, but they always grew up with them. In fact, when we were trying to scan the pit tags, it's like a giant sort of scanner for the groceries or whatever. We sometimes scan the eels because they were just waiting, and you could see them just waiting there. You could pactate several pet ones, and one would have a lamprey out of it and would be scanning. But no, we didn't find any with scanning. But you know, it's just part of the natural world. But that's probably why their behaviour's like that as well, because they're involved with that predator.
Can I ask you a question just now, Jane?
Yeah.
The difference in use of the catchment, the upper less modified catchment is perhaps steeper?
Yeah, that could be it too. They were also quite, we did travel a lot in that catchment in the bush. It was amazing, but there were quite a lot of waterfalls and high places that we struggled at as well. Yeah. And once they find a suitable place, they don't move from that either. That's on the male or female end up catching up in the same hole. And maybe that's why they look so glamorous and then they don't really worry about what they look like. But there's quite a range of what spawning ground can look like. Well, So you can be quite natural to very modified, even falling in banks. So some river works happened in that stretch as well, and unfortunately we witnessed some of the pests being dug up. So no one knows they're there. It's so cryptic.
Are they all one and done, or are they like once they're freshwater, then they'll stay and they'll breed?
No, they'll die. Yeah, so they do die afterwards. The female dies a bit earlier than the males, and sometimes the males get flushed out. Sometimes white baiters find them and they go, ooh, what's this horrible thing? It's actually just a spent male who's just been washed out.
So do the adults feed once they come back into fresh water or not?
No. So that's why they're highly sought after when they come in, because they've got a lot of lipids in them. Yeah, but they don't feed after that. Yeah. So predicting whether they are spawning is a bit difficult unless you want to spend lots of time tagging and then doing that. Single male and female do pair up and nest, and I have some videos of them protecting their nests soon. So their habitat is quite consistent. It's enclosed cavity with good water flow and a solid flat surface for where they put the eggs. So it's all very sticky. You'll see them when we've got the videos of them moving in the water. We found them sharing nests with coda and bullies, whether those species like hanging out with each other or also like hiding away from eels. But we did find a little bit of a community going on in that space. And potentially that might be something that helps other species. And there has been research in the States looking at the co-occurrence of things like freshwater mussels and lamprey, and looking at the fact that they do better together. So that might also be a consideration as well. When you're looking at one species, look at the others as well. So you'll see this, there's males and females will attack the camera, so you can actually physically feel them tugging. Yeah. And then go a bit of a suck on there. But it is a tug when you're in there. They're actively guarding that nest. And sometimes we saw there was a couple of males in the nest that they'll just completely cover, or just twine themselves in with eggs. So they're looking after their babies. Quite amazing. Yep, and I must have cut out the picture of the girl. I'll show you later. We did have a video of a girl, and for some reason Cindy called it Jane, and it actually spat at the camera. It took in sort of sediment and stones, and it spat it out. So it's quite unusual behaviour, and I don't know why Cindy called it Jane. So there's a lot of pressures, and I think all you're aware there's a lot of pressures on our freshwater native fisheries. Loss of habitat, the fact that bits of the river and different water bodies are disconnected, the fact that land has changed, the land use has changed, infrastructure, those sort of things. Harvest, there's no commercial harvest. I think there used to be in the early days, and I do have accounts of that being, but there's none anymore. So it's generally managed by customary harvest. There is some recreational harvest. We have no idea how much that is. But areas like the Matariki requires permits, and so that's a way of managing that. And there's also accounts of bycatch from white baiters. White baiters, sometimes put them back in and sometimes don't. The whole lot of issues that potential contamination, disease, parasites, and the reddening syndrome is one. We're not sure. It's called a syndrome, we're not entirely sure what exactly it is. Predation, obviously you've got the natural ones, shags, tuna, trout, love them, and I think that they've actually got a fly for the blue ones that come out, which is quite unique. So obviously fishermen also have a lot of knowledge on the species. And seals, I had accounts of seals coming way inland chasing runs of these fish. It's pretty amazing, really inland, because they were, and I can understand why, they would have been highly nutritious. I mean, there's still a basic lack of information. We know nothing about what they do on the sea. We know nothing about really what they're attaching to. There's sort of siloing of management for freshwater. They're not managing it from the mountains to the sea, or the uses. We're not very good at joining the dots together, and our species kind of need us, and we, as a people, need it to be joined together. There's not much of a variety of native species, native fisheries. Fish are not recognised in the Wildlife Act as actual animals, so there's not much recognition of that. And they have a bit of an image problem. Let's face it, people, first thing they tell me is that they've got big suckers and they're vampires. And so they have an image problem, and we just need to love them without the respect the teeth. So protecting their habitats, they are adaptable when it comes to spawning habitat. So this is the Stye or Styx River in the Christchurch. I always get that wrong. And they have adapted to these box sort of drains, and they're actually nesting behind there. Yeah. So, City Council was thinking they're beautifying things until they realised that actually it's an endangered species, isn't there? So they are adaptable. We still just don't know exactly all the places that they are spawning. In Ōraka-Aparima in Canterbury, near Waihopai and Awarua Rūnanga, they were nesting under big boulders. So they're using different habitats to spawn. We need better ways of actually finding where they are in the rocks, like sonar or something, because at the moment we have to break in, and that's, if you've got an eel nearby, you're really risking it, and it was incredibly devastating. You can use those passive detection tools like those pheromone samplers, and EMD and A is becoming more and more possible and has been used. Again, a non-detect doesn't mean it's not there. To locate key spawning areas, because we're practically saying that if we can look at larvae as the proxy, then maybe we can just look up to the other areas as well. The species has been recognised as probably being very vulnerable to climate change. It's one of the more vulnerable, and there was work done by Manawa looking at certain vulnerability for Tonga species. With climate change, temperatures are going to increase, and this is a species that's not a tropical species. So whatever we can do to help keep the waters cool and make it as natural as possible with shading, the better for that species and other species as well. So I suppose the take-home messages are, it is the ultimate living fossil. It is a Tonga species, a very special species that you have in the Waihopai catchment. It's an incredible species among all the others that you do have and are looking at in this area. Identifying spawning habitat is difficult, but it's easier to find the larvae, so use that. It's the only known species that actually is known to guard their nest, so again another unique feature of the species. There has been research based in Southland, so you need to be proud of that the knowledge that we have has become from mostly here, and the knowledge from the harvesters. It really needs our help as well. And if you guys can become advocates for that, highlighting that its image is not all bad, that it's actually quite beautiful, then that would be grand. And I've got a few acknowledgements with all the Rūnanga and Murihiku who have shared generously their knowledge and also helped in all the work that we have done. Dr Cindy Baker, all the landowners that allowed us to trap up and down their properties. I mean, that was very giving of them as well. Awesome. Funders, important as well. And also Manawa and Murihiku who are actually sharing those abundance information about in your catchment. And I thought hopefully we'll make t-shirts saying I love Kanakana Southland and have that proudly on your. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. We do have time for questions. So, I'm going to dance now. Yeah. So if you do have questions, please ask. Please project so that we can hear that, and it might get picked up on the video recording. So I'll hand it back. Vanessa.
How are they prepared and eaten? Like how do...
There are very different techniques. Some will salt them first to get the slime off. You can smoke them. You can put them in a hot girdle with lots of butter. That's quite delicious. Some do smoke them as well. You can put them in casseroles. I met people from Portugal that they have this sort of proud association, and I think they call themselves the Knights of the Lamprey or something like that. And they do special casseroles in Portugal. Yeah, a variety of different ways.
Would you have to take the skin off? Or?
No, you can eat it whole. I probably wouldn't eat the head, but because it's cartilaginous, you can actually eat the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's very rich. This is coming from someone who eats birds a lot. It's very, very rich.
So they used to preserve them, like
Deep dry, probably.
Dry.
Yeah, or putting them in fat. So that's often the way we do different species is make them airtight.
Are they nitrate sensitive?
I'm not sure. They will be sensitive because of their skin, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily nitrates that are being an issue. I think it's a lot of combination of things. And potentially because they stick around in one area a lot, they might be a bit more sensitive to different contaminants as well. Just talking something that's been in the sediments, staying hot, or just staying in a cavity. Yeah.
So do they produce a huge amount of mucus like hagfish or not?
Not as much. It's mostly when they're stressed. So you, yeah. So you put them in a bucket or something, they might get a bit, but not as bad as the
But like
hagfish. Hagfish, yeah. That horrible stories of hagfish.
Yeah, are these one of our only fish that travel as adults up into the rivers?
No, there'll be other fish as well that come
Like
up.
native fish, like the eels go the other way, but
Yep, they also go the other way. You'll have some like your whitebait species like inanga. They'll go out and then back in as well. So
Yeah.
you have those kind of species. Yeah, so they're not just the only one.
so was they important to the forest when they?
Oh yeah, they would be a huge nutrient source for
Like
and
the
food
salmon.
source. The same like with the smelt. So with them, they would probably be a huge food source for everything else in the awa. And there is work looking at isotopes. So it's a way of looking at chemically what's being eaten and what they're eating. And so there is some research that's being done on inanga and how important that might be for different fish species and native fish species as well. So yeah, they feed everything else. And they've found that a lot in the States as well. They talk about it being a major thing to contribute to the food source in that river. Yeah.
Do you think that the lamprey and kanakana migrating from sea also require scent to be attracted? Are they like the juvenile, the alvas that find the waterways to go up? They're attracted by the scent of tuna up those catchments?
Yeah. So they won't be going to the natal areas, unlikely, but they'll probably be put on their nose and trying to get the scent. So that's potentially a tool for restoring areas, is using that smell. You just have to make sure the habitat is sufficient to hold them.
Yes.
And that's potentially a tool for those catchments that have lost them, or at the point where it may not be so great. So it's,
Random question.
Yes.
You talked about them in terms of when they're parasitic and attaching to marine mammals and that. Do they attach to sharks? And would they attach to great whites? And I'm just wondering if that's ever been picked up with the great white shark stuff that's been done.
No, we haven't picked it up, but they could.
Yeah.
We don't know, and we're sort of relying on people to report the marks, whether they're caught or something.
Of course, yeah.
So it's unknown, and we try to do a little bit of isotope work, but it just didn't really tell us much.
Yeah.
Then there's the stories of the marks on whales and things like that, but is it? Yeah. So it is quite difficult. It would be great to know what species, and if there's certain species that we're relying on to migrate around the ocean as well. and they've been picked up in sort of subantarctic waters and albatross diets and stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, it's like a needle in a haystack kind of combination. Yeah.
Have you had significant reports from what used to run into the Manawa?
Yeah, that one's a difficult one because of the way it's changed. Because you always get reports of them, and you're probably one of them, is reporting them in the Manawa with the runs trying to get attracted by certain flows there. And there's certainly Manawa, the pioneer is doing work and trying to find kanakana in that catchment in the Manawa, just around that area, that confluence. In the Waio, it's been picking up pheromones in that area, so they're certainly in there. I'm not sure about in that river. I would assume it would be there, but
Yeah, and there's local people that was, clearly remember vast numbers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, any other questions?
What do you think the, having a weir by the Manawa is effective in getting upstream?
Good question.
Yeah, that is a good question, and that's one of the reasons why Murihiku's currently looking at this fish, because the really kanakana don't get fish ramps, and it would be expected. It's a species that really, yes, it can climb, but it would probably need some help, and it needs special ramps as well, the way it sort of sucks and goes up there. And it's often people would say that in the northern hemisphere they do have contraptions to actually help them, but our fish move slightly differently. So again, Cindy's been doing some work on actually what attachments and what's the best way of allowing that access. But yeah, it's, with the Matariki, with the Clutha, they've got a lot of dams there, and we really would like to see those lamprey getting up where they need to go as well. Yeah, so that's a very important aspect that we're concerned of.
Like you said, with the Clyde Dam, there's no way they're getting up there.
No, and there's no special traps or anything, so it's just being able to actually say, well, and using the research that's currently done and applying it to be a way of actually helping these species actually get back to where they should be as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Are you aware of any runs that have happened recently, or
I
are we
know
about
there
to
were-
expect one with?
You would with the amount of water that's been pumping out earlier on, and like I mentioned, May can be when you start hoping it, but it can be during the year. Whitebaiters can catch them in the lower Waio as well, so that's the August time.
Yeah.
But yeah, they should be coming up now, and I know the Waikawa's had runs already.
Yeah.
Keeps on running about that, so it's gone.
Well, thank you very much. That's really cool. I've already heard you talk a bit about kanakana recently, but to have all of that information put together in a presentation for us, and to hear specifically about the Waio catchment, because I know for many of us it's a time a place that we spend a lot of time. So really, really appreciate it. And on behalf of the Trust, just want to say a special thank you. Tomorrow Jane's going to be visiting Fielden College and spending some time with the Year 9 classes with Devon. So that'll be really cool for the students that get that opportunity as part of their learning as well too. So massive appreciation. Thank you.
And thank you for no one falling asleep during my talk.
It wasn't that hard.